Deep in the Appalachian wilderness, where civilization ends and ancient secrets begin, investigators discovered something that challenged everything medical science understood about human survival. The Whitmore family had lived in complete isolation for 3 generations, hidden in a valley that maps forgot to include. When authorities finally reached their remote homestead, they found children whose very existence defied explanation. These weren't ordinary mountain folk. The family's bloodline had been carefully preserved through generations of brothers and sisters, bearing children together, creating offspring with conditions that baffled every specialist who examined them. Some displayed extraordinary abilities alongside severe deformities. Others seemed to possess an uncanny understanding of the forest that surrounded them, as if the isolation had awakened something primal in their genetic code. The doctors who studied them found medical anomalies that shouldn't have been survivable. Yet somehow these children thrived in ways that contradicted decades of genetic research. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't their physical condition. What secret knowledge had the Whitmore family protected for over a century that made their sacrifice worthwhile? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Copper Ridge like a shroud when Park Ranger Tom Sullivan first spotted the smoke rising from the valley below. In his 23 years patrolling these mountains, he'd never seen a settlement in that particular hollow. His weathered hands traced the topographical map spread across his truck's hood, but the coordinates showed nothing but wilderness. Dr. David Chen's journal would later document that first encounter with clinical precision, though her handwriting betrayed the tremor in her hands. Sullivan had radioed for medical assistance after discovering what he initially believed to be victims of a terrible accident. The children he found bore deformities so severe he assumed they'd been burned or attacked by wild animals. The descent into Whitmore Valley took Sullivan 3 hours through terrain that seemed designed to discourage visitors. Ancient oaks formed a canopy so dense that noon felt like twilight. Game trails led nowhere, circling back on themselves as if the forest itself was playing tricks. When he finally reached the valley floor, the silence struck him first. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet that made his ears ring. The homestead appeared gradually through the trees, materializing like something from another century. A 2-story cabin built from hand-hewn logs dominated a small clearing, its foundation stones arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Smaller outbuildings clustered around it like children seeking protection from their mother. Gardens sprawled between the structures, but the plants growing there weren't found in any botanical guide, Sullivan knew. Smoke curled from the main cabin's chimney, carrying scents that reminded him of his grandmother's root cellar mixed with something medicinal and sharp. He called out a greeting, his voice swallowed by the unnatural quiet. No response came, but he sensed eyes watching from the shadows between buildings. The first child appeared at the edge of the tree line, moving with a peculiar gait that suggested both caution and confidence. Sullivan's breath caught in his throat. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, but his face held an ancient quality that made age impossible to determine. Pale skin stretched over prominent bones, and his eyes seemed too large for his skull. Most unsettling were his fingers, elongated and ending in what looked almost like claws, though they moved with surprising grace. More children emerged from various hiding places, each displaying their own collection of physical anomalies. A girl with translucent skin that revealed the delicate network of veins beneath. Twin boys whose limbs bent at impossible angles, yet who moved without apparent discomfort. All of them shared that same unsettling gaze, as if they could see through him to something beyond. Sullivan reached for his radio, but found his hand frozen in place. The children hadn't moved closer, but their collective attention felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. His training told him to establish communication, assess the situation, call for backup. Instead, he found himself asking the most basic question that came to mind. "Are you hurt?" The first boy tilted his head, studying Sullivan with an expression of mild curiosity. When he spoke, his voice carried an accent Sullivan couldn't place, something that suggested education despite their obvious isolation. Hurt, the word seemed to puzzle him. We are, as we have always been, as we were meant to be. Before Sullivan could respond, an adult figure appeared in the cabin's doorway. The man who emerged moved with the careful dignity of age, though his actual years were impossible to guess. Tall and gaunt, he wore clothes that might have been fashionable 50 years ago, meticulously maintained despite their obvious age. His hair, white as fresh snow, hung in a neat braid down his back. "Children," the man's voice carried quiet authority, "return to your tasks. This gentleman means us no harm." The children dispersed as quickly as they'd appeared, melting back into the forest with an ease that suggested they'd practiced the maneuver many times. The man approached Sullivan with measured steps, his pale eyes never leaving the ranger's face. "I am Ezra Whitmore," he said, extending a hand that felt like dry paper against Sullivan's palm. "Welcome to our valley. I suspect you have questions." Sullivan found his voice, though it came out rougher than intended. "Sir, I need to ask about these children. They appear to need medical attention." Ezra's smile held no warmth, only a patient sadness that seemed to carry the weight of generations. "Medical attention," he repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose that would be the natural assumption. Tell me, Ranger Sullivan, how far did you travel to reach us?" The fact that this man knew his name sent a chill down Sullivan's spine, though he couldn't remember introducing himself. 3 hours through the forest. I saw smoke from Copper Ridge." 3 hours. Ezra nodded slowly. "And in those 3 hours, did you not find it strange that your radio failed to work? That your GPS readings became unreliable?" Sullivan's hand moved instinctively to his equipment belt. His radio crackled with static when he tried it, and his GPS unit showed coordinates that placed him somewhere in the middle of a lake according to his maps. "Doctor." Margaret Chen arrived at the staging area 36 hours after Sullivan's initial radio call reached the outside world. The vintage medical bag she carried had belonged to her grandfather, a country doctor who'd served rural communities in the 1942. Its worn leather exterior concealed modern diagnostic equipment alongside herbs and primitive surgical tools that spoke of medical practices from another era. The assembled team gathered around folding tables set up in the parking lot of Copper Ridge State Park represented an unusual collaboration between disciplines. Dr. James Holloway, a geneticist from Johns Hopkins, methodically checked and rechecked his portable DNA analysis equipment. Dr. Sarah Martinez, whose psychiatric expertise had been requested after Sullivan's initial report, reviewed her notes with the careful attention of someone expecting the impossible. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the cultural anthropologist who'd studied isolated communities across 3 continents, spread topographical maps across the aluminum table surface. Her weathered hands traced the contours of the mountains while she spoke in measured tones about the challenges they might face. "Isolation does strange things to communities," she explained to the group. "I've seen families in the Amazon who've maintained the same practices for centuries, but this level of genetic isolation suggests something more deliberate than simple geographic separation." Chen opened her grandfather's medical bag, the brass clasps worn smooth by decades of use. Inside, modern digital instruments nestled alongside glass vials filled with herbs she'd collected from traditional healers around the world. Her grandfather had taught her that sometimes the old ways held wisdom that modern medicine had forgotten. The ranger's description suggests congenital abnormalities severe enough to be life-threatening, Chen said, consulting her preliminary notes. Yet these children appear to be thriving. That contradiction alone warrants investigation. Holloway looked up from his equipment, pushing wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. Inbreeding depression typically manifests within 3 generations. If Sullivan's observations are accurate, we're looking at a family that somehow circumvented one of genetics' most fundamental laws. The journey into Whitmore Valley began at dawn, following the path Sullivan had marked during his return trip. The forest seemed different in the early morning light, less oppressive but somehow more watchful. Ancient trees formed a cathedral overhead, their branches intertwining in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural. Martinez walked slightly apart from the group, her trained eye cataloging environmental details that might affect psychological states. The silence troubled her most. Forests should teem with life, but this wilderness felt suspended in an unnatural quiet that made conversation seem like an intrusion. "Notice the lack of wildlife," she murmured to Vasquez. "No insects, no bird calls. It's as if the ecosystem has been curated somehow." Vasquez nodded, her anthropologist's instincts picking up on subtler environmental cues. "The trail markers aren't random," she observed. "Those stone cairns we've passed follow a specific pattern. Someone's been guiding traffic through this forest for a very long time." 2 hours into their descent, Chen's equipment began registering anomalous readings. Her electromagnetic field detector, designed to identify medical devices, showed consistent pulses coming from the valley below. The pattern resembled a heartbeat, steady and rhythmic, but far too large to originate from any human source. "We should establish a baseline before we make contact," Holloway suggested, unpacking his portable genetic sequencer. "If we're dealing with an isolated population, documenting their genome could provide invaluable insights into human genetic adaptation." Chen pulled out one of her grandfather's glass vials, this one containing herbs she'd gathered from a traditional healer in Appalachia. The old woman had insisted these particular plants grew only in places where the earth remembers old wounds. Looking at the strange vegetation surrounding their path, Chen wondered if her grandfather's folk medicine might be more relevant than modern medical training. The first glimpse of the Whitmore homestead came suddenly, the forest opening into a clearing that felt carved from the wilderness rather than naturally occurring. The main cabin stood like a monument to stubbornness, its logs hand-hewn from trees that must have taken centuries to grow. Smaller buildings clustered around it in arrangements that followed no architectural logic Chen recognized. The construction techniques are consistent with mid-19th century Appalachian building practices, Vasquez noted, photographing the structures with practiced efficiency. But the foundation stones have been arranged in patterns I've never seen before, possibly ceremonial in nature. Movement at the forest edge caught their attention. The children appeared as Sullivan had described, but seeing them in person drove home the impossibility of their existence. Genetic science insisted that such severe deformities should be accompanied by intellectual disabilities, organ failures, shortened lifespans. Yet these children moved with confidence and displayed an alertness that suggested not just survival, but adaptation. Ezra Whitmore emerged from the main cabin exactly as Sullivan had described him, moving with that same careful dignity. But Chen's medical training noticed details the ranger had missed. The man's pupils dilated and contracted independently of light changes. His breathing pattern followed rhythms that didn't match normal human physiology. Most troubling, her electromagnetic detector showed the same rhythmic pulses emanating directly from his location. The carved bone whistle hung from the youngest child's neck on a cord made from sinew. When she raised it to her lips, the sound that emerged fell below the range of human hearing, yet every member of the Whitmore family turned their heads in unison. Chen's equipment registered the subsonic frequencies, but the team felt only a subtle vibration in their bones. The child who had summoned them couldn't have been more than 8 years old, though her eyes held depths that suggested centuries of accumulated knowledge. Her name was Lily, Ezra explained, and she served as the family's communicator with what he called the deeper voices of the valley. Lily was born with certain sensitivities, Ezra said, watching as the child tucked the whistle back beneath her homespun dress. "She can hear what the forest tells us. It's how we've survived here for so long." Dr. Martinez crouched down to Lily's eye level, employing the careful approach she'd learned from decades of working with traumatized children. "Hello, Lily. That's a beautiful whistle. Did you make it yourself?" The child's response came in a voice that carried the cadence of much older speech patterns. "Great-great-grandmother carved it from the first deer that offered itself to our family. The bone remembers the deer's knowledge of these paths." Chen's medical instruments detected abnormalities in Lily's respiratory system that should have made speech difficult, yet her words came with crystalline clarity. X-ray imaging revealed lung chambers arranged in configurations that didn't match any human anatomy textbook, yet functioned with remarkable efficiency. Marcus and Matthew, the twin boys Sullivan had mentioned, demonstrated their own impossible adaptations. Their limbs bent at angles that should have indicated multiple fractures, but bone density scans showed skeletal structures that were actually stronger than normal human bones. They moved through the forest with a fluid grace that made the terrain seem irrelevant. "We know every tree in a day's walk," Marcus explained, his voice carrying the same archaic formality as his siblings. "Every stone, every stream, every creature that makes its home here, the forest teaches us." Dr. Holloway's genetic equipment detected mutations in their bone formation, genes that standard medical knowledge insisted should be lethal. Instead, these children had developed skeletal systems that allowed unprecedented flexibility while maintaining structural integrity. The implications challenged fundamental assumptions about human physical limitations. The girl with translucent skin introduced herself as Vera. Through her pale flesh, the team could observe her circulatory system in real time, watching blood flow through vessels that pulsed with patterns Chen had never encountered in medical literature. Yet Vera showed no signs of the circulatory deficiencies that such transparency should indicate. "The blood carries messages," Vera explained when Chen asked about her condition. "I can feel what the forest feels, know when strangers approach, sense when the balance shifts. It's not a sickness, it's a gift." Dr. Vasquez documented the children's interaction with their environment, noting behaviors that suggested an almost supernatural connection to the natural world. They moved through undergrowth without disturbing a single leaf, identified edible plants by touch alone, and seemed to anticipate weather changes hours before they occurred. Their knowledge base exceeds what should be possible for children raised in isolation, Vasquez whispered to her colleagues. "They're demonstrating understanding of botanical properties, weather patterns, and animal behavior that would require formal education or decades of experience." The oldest visible child, a boy named Gabriel who appeared to be around 16, displayed the most striking adaptations. His eyes had developed a reflective quality that allowed exceptional night vision, while his hearing picked up frequencies that registered on Chen's equipment but remained inaudible to the medical team. "I listen to the mountain's heartbeat," Gabriel explained when asked about his abilities. "It tells me when danger approaches, when the seasons will change, when the old promises need to be renewed. Father says I'll understand more when I'm older." Chen's examination revealed that Gabriel's sensory organs had undergone modifications that pushed the boundaries of human evolution. His retinas contained additional layers of photoreceptive cells, while his inner ear structures showed adaptations typically found in animals with echolocation abilities. The children moved as a coordinated unit, responding to signals the medical team couldn't detect. When Lily blew her bone whistle again, they arranged themselves in a semicircle around the visitors, their collective attention creating an almost tangible pressure in the air. "They want to show you something," Ezra said, noting the team's discomfort. "The children believe you've come here for a reason. They wish to share what they've learned from living in harmony with forces most people never encounter." Dr. Martinez felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The children's behavior suggested not just adaptation to their environment, but active communication with it. Their genetic modifications appeared purposeful rather than random, as if someone had deliberately guided their development towards specific capabilities. As the afternoon light filtered through the canopy above, casting strange shadows across the clearing, the children began to demonstrate abilities that challenged everything the medical team thought they understood about human potential. The daguerreotype portrait sat on the mantelpiece like a window into another century. The sepia-toned image showed a young man and woman standing side by side, their formal poses unable to disguise the unmistakable similarity of their features. Brother and sister, captured in silver and shadow, their eyes holding secrets that would echo through generations. Ezra Whitmore lifted the portrait with reverent hands, his fingers tracing the ornate silver frame that had somehow survived over a century in the wilderness. The photograph itself bore the technical hallmarks of 1847 craftsmanship, its surface etched with the delicate precision that only early photographic processes could achieve. "Jeremiah and Constance Whitmore," Ezra said, his voice carrying the weight of inherited memory. "Our founders. My great-great-grandparents. They came to this valley fleeing persecution, carrying knowledge that the outside world deemed too dangerous to possess." Dr. Vasquez leaned closer, her anthropologist's eye examining the clothing and positioning captured in the image. The subjects wore garments of obvious quality, suggesting education and social standing inconsistent with the frontier setting they'd chosen for their exile. "What kind of persecution?" Dr. Martinez asked, her psychiatric training recognizing the careful way Ezra handled the photograph, as if it contained something more volatile than mere memory. Ezra set the portrait back in its place of honor, his pale eyes reflecting the lamplight in ways that seemed to shift the shadows around them. They were accused of practicing what the church called ungodly sciences. Jeremiah had studied medicine at Harvard, but his interests extended into areas that conventional learning couldn't accommodate. The old man moved to a hand-carved wooden chest that dominated one corner of the main room. When he opened it, the scent of old paper and dried herbs escaped like breath from a tomb. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay documents that predated the establishment of most American medical institutions. Constance possessed what people today might call psychic abilities, Ezra continued, extracting a leather-bound journal whose pages crackled with age. She could sense the connections between living things, understand how bloodlines carried more than just physical traits. Together, they discovered that certain genetic combinations could preserve and enhance human capabilities that civilization had forgotten. Dr. Holloway's scientific mind recoiled at the implications, but his equipment continued registering electromagnetic anomalies that defied conventional explanation. "Are you suggesting they deliberately chose to intermarry to preserve these abilities?" "Not chose," Ezra corrected gently, "were called to. The knowledge they carried came with obligations. Certain bloodlines serve as guardians for forces older than recorded history. Jeremiah and Constance understood that their children would need to be more than human to fulfill that responsibility." The journal Ezra held contained diagrams that looked like anatomical drawings crossed with mystical symbols. Genetic charts traced bloodlines with mathematical precision, but included notations about spiritual inheritance that challenged every academic discipline represented by the visiting team. "The persecution began when Constance's abilities became public knowledge," Ezra explained, turning pages with careful reverence. She could predict weather patterns months in advance, identify diseases before symptoms appeared, and communicate with animals in ways that frightened their neighbors. When drought threatened their Massachusetts community, she guided them to water sources that saved hundreds of lives. Dr. Chen studied the medical notations scattered throughout the journal, recognizing anatomical accuracy that exceeded what 1,840 seconds medical training should have provided. Detailed drawings showed circulatory and nervous system variations that matched what she'd observed in the Whitmore children, suggesting these modifications weren't accidental mutations, but deliberate adaptations. Gratitude turned to suspicion when other communities experienced crop failures while theirs flourished. Ezra continued. Religious leaders declared Constance's abilities demonic. Jeremiah's medical practices were labeled witchcraft. They had perhaps 6 months before accusations would become formal charges. The chest contained other artifacts that spoke of hasty departure, maps marked with routes through wilderness areas, lists of supplies written in multiple hands, letters from sympathizers warning of approaching danger. The documentary evidence painted a picture of two intellectuals fleeing persecution with knowledge they believed too important to lose. "So they came here," Dr. Vasquez observed, understanding the historical context of westward expansion and religious persecution that had driven many unconventional communities into wilderness isolation. "They came here because the valley called to them," Ezra corrected. Constance's abilities guided them to this specific location. She sensed something in the earth itself, something that resonated with the knowledge they carried. The valley offered protection, but it also demanded service. Dr. Martinez noted the careful way Ezra spoke about his ancestors, as if their story carried implications that extended beyond simple family history. What kind of service? Ezra closed the journal, but his hands remained pressed against its cover, as if drawing strength from its contents. Some knowledge requires guardians. Some forces need human intermediaries to maintain balance between what was and what might be. Jeremiah and Constance understood that their bloodline would need to remain pure to preserve the abilities necessary for that guardianship. The afternoon light streaming through the cabin's windows seemed to dim as Ezra spoke, shadows lengthening in ways that had nothing to do with the sun's position. The children, who had been playing quietly outside, fell silent, as if responding to some signal the adults couldn't detect. The laboratory blood sample vials contained liquid that defied every principle of hematology Dr. Chen had learned in 20 years of medical practice. Under normal lighting, the blood appeared typical enough, but when exposed to her portable spectral analysis equipment, it revealed cellular structures that shouldn't exist in any known mammalian species. Chen held one of the glass vials up to the afternoon light, filtering through the cabin's windows. The sample had come from Gabriel, the 16-year-old with enhanced sensory capabilities, and it moved with a viscosity that suggested additional proteins her field equipment couldn't identify. More troubling, the blood remained warm to the touch despite being drawn hours earlier. The cellular composition shows modifications I've never encountered, Chen murmured to Dr. Holloway, who was running his own genetic analysis on samples from each family member. The red blood cells carry approximately 30% more oxygen than normal, but they've also developed additional organelles that serve unknown functions. Holloway looked up from his portable DNA sequencer, his face pale with scientific confusion. The genetic markers I'm detecting shouldn't be compatible with human life. These children carry chromosome variations that standard genetics textbooks classify as invariably lethal, yet they show enhanced physical capabilities rather than deficiencies. The blood samples sat in a neat row on the cabin's kitchen table, each labeled with a family member's name. Ezra had consented to the testing with the resigned patience of someone who understood that proof would be necessary before belief could follow. The children had submitted to the blood draws with surprising calm, as if medical examinations were routine rather than their first contact with modern medicine. Lily's sample showed the most dramatic variations. Her blood contained cells that appeared to communicate with each other through bioelectric signals, creating patterns that resembled neural network activity. When Chen exposed the sample to various stimuli, the cellular response suggested awareness that challenged fundamental assumptions about the boundary between individual cells and organized consciousness. It's as if her blood is thinking, Chen whispered, documenting readings that her training insisted must be equipment malfunctions. The cellular activity shows coordination that implies some form of distributed intelligence. The twins, Marcus and Matthew, displayed synchronous genetic patterns that went beyond typical identical twin genetics. Their blood samples responded to each other's presence, cells showing increased activity when the vials were placed in proximity. Separation by more than 3 feet caused measurable stress responses in both samples. Their genetic connection extends beyond shared DNA, Holloway observed, running tests that confirmed his growing suspicion that conventional scientific categories were inadequate for understanding the Whitmore family. They're demonstrating biological entanglement on a cellular level. Vera's translucent blood revealed why her skin allowed such clear observation of her circulatory system. The plasma contained reflective particles that enhanced light transmission while somehow maintaining normal blood viscosity and clotting properties. Her sample glowed with a faint bioluminescence that intensified when exposed to electromagnetic fields. Dr. Martinez documented the psychological implications of these findings, noting that blood chemistry often correlated with neurological function in ways that could explain the children's unusual mental capabilities. If their blood chemistry has been modified to this extent, we need to consider how it might be affecting their brain function. The most disturbing discovery came when Chen analyzed Ezra's blood sample. Despite his apparent age, his cellular structure showed signs of regeneration that suggested biological processes that should have ceased decades earlier. His telomeres, the cellular structures that typically shorten with age, appeared to be maintaining their length through mechanisms that modern medicine couldn't explain. His blood is essentially ageless, Chen reported, her voice tight with scientific disbelief. The cellular aging markers I'm detecting suggest biological age somewhere in his 30s, regardless of his apparent chronological age. Sarah Whitmore, the family matriarch, whom they'd yet to meet, had also provided a sample through Ezra. Her blood showed similar anti-aging properties, but with additional modifications that suggested enhanced resistance to toxins and disease. The sample contained antibodies for diseases that hadn't existed when she would have been born, as if her immune system could adapt to threats it had never encountered. The preservation of bloodline purity appears to have concentrated these genetic modifications rather than causing the expected degradation, Holloway concluded, staring at test results that contradicted everything he thought he understood about population genetics. Somehow, this family has avoided inbreeding depression and instead achieved genetic enhancement. Chen's hands trembled slightly as she sealed the samples for storage. The blood in these vials represented evidence of human evolution that challenged the basic assumptions of medical science. But more troubling than the scientific implications was the growing certainty that these modifications served a purpose beyond simple survival. As she documented her findings, the blood samples began responding to something in the environment, their cellular activity increasing in synchronized patterns that suggested communication with forces beyond the laboratory equipment's ability to detect. The vials grew warmer, their contents moving with sudden urgency that made Chen step back from the table. Outside the cabin, the forest had fallen into the same unnatural silence that had marked their arrival, as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. The ancient stone circle lay hidden deep within the forest, its 12 standing stones arranged in a pattern that seemed to pulse with invisible energy. Each stone bore carved symbols that predated any known writing system, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of weather, yet somehow still radiating an aura of deliberate purpose. Gabriel led the medical team through pathways that existed only when the Whitmore children guided them. Without their presence, the forest seemed to shift and rearrange itself, trails leading in circles or simply vanishing into impenetrable undergrowth. With the children as guides, passages opened that had been invisible moments before. "The stones have been here since before our family arrived," Gabriel explained, his enhanced senses allowing him to navigate terrain that would have been treacherous for normal humans. Great-great-grandmother Constance said they called to her from across hundreds of miles, drawing her to this valley. Dr. Vasquez documented the megalithic structure with growing amazement. Each stone stood approximately 8 feet tall, cut from a type of granite that geological surveys insisted didn't exist in this region. The precision of their placement suggested advanced understanding of astronomy and mathematics that challenged assumptions about pre-Columbian civilization in Appalachia. Lily approached the nearest stone and placed her small hand against its carved surface. The subsonic frequencies she could detect seemed to emanate from the stone itself, creating vibrations that her bone whistle could echo and amplify. When she blew a soft note, the stones responded with harmonics that made the air itself feel thick and resonant. "They sing to each other," she explained to Dr. Chen, who was attempting to measure the electromagnetic fields surrounding the circle. "Different songs for different seasons, different times of day. The songs tell us when the old agreements need to be renewed." The twins, Marcus and Matthew, moved around the circle's perimeter with synchronized steps, their impossible flexibility, allowing them to navigate the uneven ground without disturbing the arrangement of smaller stones that formed complex geometric patterns between the larger monoliths. Their movements seemed choreographed, as if following steps learned through generations of practice. Dr. Martinez observed the children's behavior with growing unease. Their interaction with the stone circle suggested ritualistic knowledge that went far beyond simple cultural traditions. The precision of their movements and the reverent way they approached each carved stone implied active communication with forces that conventional psychology couldn't categorize. The patterns between the stones change, Vera noted, her translucent skin allowing the team to observe her circulatory system's response to the electromagnetic fields surrounding the megalithic structure. Her blood flow increased dramatically when she approached certain stones, while others seemed to calm her physiological responses. Chen's equipment detected energy signatures that defied classification. The stones generated electromagnetic fields that pulsed in patterns resembling neural activity, but at a scale that suggested consciousness operating on geological timescales. Her readings indicated that the entire circle functioned as a single, massive biological system. "The stones are alive," Gabriel said simply, noting the team's confusion over their instrument readings. "Not alive like animals or plants, but aware in their own way. They remember everything that has happened in this valley for thousands of years." Dr. Holloway attempted to take geological samples from one of the smaller stones, but his diamond-tipped drill bit dulled against the surface without removing even microscopic amounts of material. The stone seemed to resist analysis, its molecular structure somehow adapting to prevent examination. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the circle, the carved symbols began to show subtle variations in their appearance. What had seemed like static designs revealed themselves as slowly shifting patterns that responded to the changing light and the presence of the Whitmore children. "The stones teach us," Marcus explained, settling into a cross-legged position beside one of the larger monoliths. "They show us memories of the time before humans walked these mountains, memories of the agreements made between those who came before and those who came after." Matthew joined his twin, their synchronized breathing creating a harmony that seemed to resonate with the stone's natural frequency. As they settled into what appeared to be meditation, the electromagnetic readings from Chen's equipment intensified dramatically. The children's collective presence appeared to activate dormant properties within the stone circle. Symbols that had been barely visible began to glow with soft bioluminescence, while the spaces between the stones filled with what looked like heat distortion but felt like something far more substantial. "They're opening a connection," Vera whispered, her enhanced sensitivity allowing her to perceive changes that the adults could only measure indirectly. "The stones are remembering why they were placed here, remembering the promises our family made when they first came to this valley." Dr. Martinez felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The children's behavior suggested not just cultural knowledge passed down through generations, but active participation in systems of communication that existed outside normal human experience. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, casting long shadows between the ancient stones, the medical team began to understand that they had stumbled upon something far more significant than an isolated family with unusual genetic modifications. The leather-bound recipe book lay open on Sarah Whitmore's kitchen table, its yellowed pages filled with formulations that challenged every principle of modern pharmacology. Written in multiple hands across generations, the recipes combined botanical ingredients with preparations that Dr. Chen's medical training insisted should be toxic rather than therapeutic. Sarah Whitmore herself moved through her kitchen with the fluid grace of someone half her apparent age. Her silver hair hung in a neat braid down her back, and her eyes held the same ancient quality that marked all members of her family. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades preserving life through knowledge that existed outside conventional medicine. "This formula has kept our children alive for over a century," Sarah explained, indicating a recipe written in faded brown ink that Chen suspected was blood rather than conventional writing fluid. "Foxglove root combined with nightshade extract, balanced with herbs that grow only in the shadow of the standing stones." Dr. Chen examined the recipe with growing bewilderment. The combination of digitalis from foxglove with alkaloids from nightshade should have created a preparation guaranteed to cause cardiac arrest. Instead, Sarah's notes documented therapeutic effects that modern medicine achieved only through carefully calibrated pharmaceutical interventions. "The proportions are everything," Sarah continued, measuring dried herbs with precision that spoke of decades of practice. Too much foxglove, and the heart races beyond control. Too little nightshade and the nervous system cannot adapt to the changes our children's bodies require. The kitchen itself served as both laboratory and shrine to botanical knowledge. Dried herbs hung from every rafter, their species ranging from common medicinal plants to varieties that Chen couldn't identify despite her extensive training in ethnobotany. Glass jars lined shelves built into the cabin's walls, their contents labeled with names that appeared in no modern pharmaceutical reference. Shadow leaf for enhancing night vision, Sarah noted, following Chen's gaze across her collection. Blood moss for strengthening the circulatory modifications. Whisper vine for maintaining the neural connections that allow our children to hear what the forest tells them. Dr. Martinez documented the psychological implications of Sarah's medical practice, noting the careful way the matriarch spoke about her preparations as if they were living entities rather than simple chemical combinations. The recipes showed understanding of psychoactive properties that suggested knowledge of consciousness alteration techniques. How do you know these combinations won't harm the children? Martinez asked, observing Sarah's methodical preparation of what appeared to be a tincture designed to enhance Lily's subsonic hearing abilities. Sarah's smile held the patient sadness that seemed characteristic of all the Whitmore adults. Harm is a matter of perspective, Doctor. These children carry genetic modifications that place extraordinary demands on their physiology. Without these preparations, their enhanced capabilities would consume their bodies within months. The recipe book contained detailed anatomical drawings that showed the modifications each child required to maintain their unusual abilities. Gabriel's enhanced senses demanded preparations that supported dramatically accelerated neural activity. The twins' flexible skeletal structure required compounds that maintained bone density while allowing impossible flexibility. Each child is born with specific needs, Sarah explained, turning to a section of the book written in her own careful handwriting. Vera's translucent skin requires protection from light sensitivity while maintaining the transparency that allows her to monitor her circulatory function. Lily's subsonic abilities place enormous strain on her respiratory system. Chen observed Sarah preparing individual doses for each child, the measurements precise enough to rival modern pharmaceutical compounding. The matriarch's knowledge of drug interactions and physiological effects exceeded what should have been possible for someone without formal medical training. Where did this knowledge come from originally? Chen asked, noting recipes that predated the discovery of most pharmaceutical principles by decades. Sarah paused in her preparations, her hands stilling over the mortar and pestle she'd been using to grind dried herbs. Constance brought some of it with her when the family first came to this valley, but most came from the forest itself, from the stones, from the things that were here before humans walked these mountains. The recipe book contained sections written in symbols that matched those carved into the standing stones, suggesting that the family's medical knowledge was somehow connected to the megalithic structure's mysterious properties. Diagrams showed correlations between astronomical events and the effectiveness of various preparations. The recipes change with the seasons, Sarah continued, indicating notations that tracked lunar cycles and stellar positions. Some preparations work only during specific moon phases. Others require herbs gathered at particular times of day when the electromagnetic fields are properly aligned. Dr. Holloway examined the botanical specimens Sarah used, noting genetic variations in common plants that shouldn't occur naturally. The foxglove showed cellular modifications that concentrated its active compounds while reducing toxicity. The nightshade had developed additional alkaloids that enhanced its therapeutic properties. The plants themselves have adapted, Sarah noted, observing Holloway's analysis. 3 generations of growing in soil influenced by the standing stones has changed them, made them more suitable for our family's specific needs. As afternoon shadows fell across the kitchen, Sarah completed her preparations, each dose carefully measured and labeled for its intended recipient. The church records from 1,847 lay spread across the research table in Dr. Vasquez's makeshift field office, their brittle pages containing accusations that read like excerpts from a supernatural thriller. The documents had been discovered in the archives of 3 separate Massachusetts parishes, each containing references to the Whitmore siblings that painted a picture far darker than Ezra's family history had suggested. Jeremiah Whitmore, accused of practicing medicine through communion with demonic forces, Dr. Vasquez read aloud from a document bearing the seal of the First Congregational Church of Salem. Witnesses testify to his ability to diagnose ailments through touch alone, to prescribe treatments that violated natural law, and to perform surgical procedures that succeeded despite contradicting established medical practice. The records painted Jeremiah not as a simple country doctor, but as someone whose medical capabilities extended far beyond what 1,840 seconds training could have provided. Patient testimonies documented healings that bordered on miraculous, but also described Jeremiah's methods in terms that suggested supernatural assistance rather than advanced knowledge. Constance Whitmore demonstrated abilities that witnesses attributed to witchcraft. Another document continued. She predicted the exact date of Samuel Morrison's death 3 months before he showed symptoms of consumption. She identified the locations of missing children through methods that defied rational explanation. She communicated with animals in ways that suggested unnatural influence over God's creatures. Dr. Martinez studied the psychological profiles embedded within the religious accusations, noting patterns that suggested the siblings had displayed abilities that their community couldn't categorize within acceptable spiritual frameworks. The detailed nature of the testimonies indicated genuine phenomena rather than simple superstition or mass hysteria. The accusations escalated rapidly, Vasquez observed, arranging the documents chronologically. Initial gratitude for medical successes transformed into suspicion when the siblings' methods became too obviously supernatural to ignore. A particularly detailed account came from Reverend Ezekiel Harding, whose church records documented what he called abominations against the natural order. His meticulous handwriting described observing Jeremiah perform surgery by candlelight, his hands moving with precision that seemed guided by knowledge no human should possess. The patient, one Martha Henley, suffered from a growth in her abdomen that 3 physicians had declared inoperable, Reverend Harding wrote. Yet Jeremiah Whitmore removed this affliction using techniques that appeared to violate every principle of anatomy and divine will. Most disturbing was his apparent ability to perceive the location and nature of the growth without opening the patient's body. Constance's abilities received even more detailed documentation, with multiple witnesses describing incidents that challenged basic assumptions about human perception. She had predicted weather patterns with supernatural accuracy, located lost livestock through methods that suggested communication with the animals themselves, and demonstrated knowledge of herbal preparations that exceeded what any woman of her station should have possessed. The breaking point came during the winter of 1846. Vasquez continued reading from what appeared to be a sheriff's report. A child named Timothy Fletcher fell through ice on Morrison's Pond. When the body was recovered 3 days later, the family brought him to Jeremiah Whitmore in desperation. The report described what witnesses called a resurrection, though medical knowledge suggested the child might have been in a state of profound hypothermia rather than actual death. Jeremiah's treatment involved procedures that combined surgical intervention with what observers described as supernatural influences. The child lived, but spoke afterward of experiences that troubled his parents and pastor, the sheriff noted. He claimed to have traveled to places beyond the physical world, to have received knowledge from entities that existed outside normal human experience. These claims, combined with his miraculous recovery, convinced many that the Whitmore siblings had crossed lines that Christian society could not tolerate. Dr. Chen examined medical notations scattered throughout the church records, finding descriptions of procedures that anticipated modern surgical techniques by decades. Jeremiah appeared to have understood germ theory, antiseptic practices, and anatomical principles that wouldn't be formally recognized until the late 19th century. The final accusation came in March 1847. Vasquez read from a document signed by multiple church officials. Jeremiah and Constance Whitmore were formally accused of practicing medicine through covenant with supernatural entities. Witnesses testified that their abilities exceeded human limitations, that their knowledge came from sources beyond acceptable Christian learning. The records indicated that the siblings had perhaps 6 weeks between formal accusation and what would have been certain execution. Their escape appeared to have been carefully planned, with sympathizers providing maps, supplies, and warnings about the approaching danger. Most significantly, Vasquez noted, examining the final documents in the collection, multiple witnesses reported that strange phenomena began occurring throughout the region after the siblings' departure. Livestock became agitated, weather patterns shifted unexpectedly, and several people reported dreams filled with visions of ancient forests and standing stones. The church records suggested that Jeremiah and Constance hadn't simply fled persecution, but had been guided toward their destiny in the Appalachian Valley by forces that had been calling to them for years. The obsidian ceremonial knife lay at the center of the underground chamber like a shard of crystallized darkness. Its blade, carved from volcanic glass that shouldn't exist anywhere within 1,000 miles of Appalachia, gleamed with an edge so sharp it seemed to cut through light itself. The handle, wrapped in leather that had been stained by generations of use, bore symbols that matched those on the standing stones above. Gabriel led the medical team down stone steps that had been carved directly into the bedrock beneath the Whitmore homestead. The passage descended at an angle that suggested it followed natural fault lines in the mountain, but the precision of its construction spoke of deliberate engineering that predated any known civilization in the region. "The ritual chamber has been here since before our family arrived," Gabriel explained, his enhanced night vision allowing him to navigate the darkness while the adults fumbled with flashlights. Great-great-grandmother Constance said the stones above called to her, but it was this place that anchored their decision to remain. The chamber itself defied the geological surveys that insisted solid granite lay beneath the Whitmore property. Carved from living rock, its walls bore the same spiral patterns found on the standing stones, but here the symbols seemed to move in the flickering light, shifting and flowing as if responding to the presence of observers. Dr. Vasquez documented the chamber's construction with growing amazement. The architectural techniques required to hollow out solid granite without modern equipment should have been impossible, yet the surfaces showed tool marks that suggested hand carving accomplished over decades or centuries. At the chamber's center, a circular depression had been cut into the floor, its edges worn smooth by what appeared to be centuries of ritual use. Channels carved into the stone led from this central basin to smaller depressions arranged around the chamber's perimeter, creating a network that suggested the controlled flow of liquids. "Blood rituals," Dr. Martinez observed with clinical detachment, though her voice carried undertones of growing unease. The wear patterns suggest regular use over an extended period. The obsidian knife rested on a stone pedestal at the basin's edge, its placement suggesting it served as the focal point for whatever ceremonies had taken place in this underground sanctuary. When Gabriel approached the blade, his enhanced senses detected vibrations that resonated through the chamber's walls. "Each generation renews the covenant," Gabriel said, his young voice carrying weight that suggested knowledge beyond his apparent years. "The knife has tasted the blood of every Whitmore born in this valley. It remembers our promises, holds our obligations within its edge." Dr. Chen's electromagnetic detection equipment registered intense field variations emanating from the knife itself. The obsidian appeared to contain metallic inclusions that shouldn't occur in natural volcanic glass, creating electromagnetic properties that defied geological classification. "The blade was here when Jeremiah and Constance first entered the chamber," Gabriel continued, noting the team's scientific fascination with the artifact. They understood immediately what it represented, what it demanded from them and their descendants. The walls around the chamber bore carved records that documented generations of ritual observance. Dates carved in Roman numerals marked significant events, while symbols that matched Sarah's recipe book indicated the specific preparations used during various ceremonies. Blood sacrifice maintains the balance, Gabriel explained, his matter-of-fact tone making the words even more disturbing. Not death, but offering. Each child born to our family gives blood to renew the agreements made before recorded history began. Dr. Holloway examined the chamber's acoustical properties, noting that its dimensions created resonance effects that would amplify subsonic frequencies. The space functioned as a natural amplifier for sounds below normal human hearing range, suggesting its design had been influenced by understanding of acoustic principles. When Lily uses her bone whistle in this chamber, the entire mountain responds, Gabriel noted, observing Holloway's acoustic measurements. The stones above, the forest around us, even the underground streams that feed our valley. Everything connected through frequencies most people cannot perceive. The knife itself showed no signs of corrosion despite its apparent age, its obsidian edge maintaining sharpness that suggested supernatural preservation. When Gabriel lifted it with reverent hands, the chamber's electromagnetic fields intensified dramatically, as if the artifact served as a conductor for forces that existed beyond physical measurement. The knife chooses who may wield it, Gabriel said, noting Dr. Chen's instinctive step backward as the electromagnetic reading spiked. It has accepted our family's bloodline, but others who have attempted to touch it have experienced difficulties. As the team documented the chamber's features, shadows seemed to move independently of their flashlight beams, suggesting presence beyond what conventional perception could detect. The air itself felt thick with accumulated memory, as if centuries of ritual observance had left impressions that lingered in the space between stone and spirit. The obsidian knife pulsed with subtle bioluminescence, its black surface revealing depths that seemed to extend beyond the physical dimensions of the blade itself. The X-ray films hung from clips in Dr. Chen's makeshift examination room, their ghostly images revealing skeletal structures that challenged every principle of human anatomy. Under the stark illumination of her portable medical equipment, the Whitmore children's bones showed modifications that shouldn't exist in any terrestrial vertebrate, yet functioned with efficiency that exceeded normal human capabilities. Gabriel's spine displayed vertebrae that had developed additional articulation points, allowing flexibility that would have been impossible for standard human skeletal structure. His ribcage showed modified attachment points that permitted lung expansion far beyond normal capacity, explaining his enhanced respiratory function and ability to process the subsonic frequencies that permeated the valley. Look at the density readings, Dr. Chen murmured to Dr. Holloway, indicating measurements that defied medical logic. His bones show calcium concentrations that should make movement impossible, yet they've developed internal structures that combine maximum strength with unprecedented flexibility. The twins, Marcus and Matthew, displayed synchronized skeletal modifications that went beyond typical identical twin genetics. Their bones had developed hollow sections similar to bird anatomy, reducing weight while maintaining structural integrity. Joint surfaces showed adaptations that allowed rotation through angles that would dislocate normal human articulations. Their skeletal systems appear to have evolved specifically for their environment, Chen observed, comparing the X-rays to standard anatomical references. Every modification serves a purpose related to survival in this particular ecosystem. Lily's films revealed the most dramatic departures from human norm. Her skull had developed additional chambers that housed the enhanced auditory processing equipment necessary for her subsonic abilities. Bone structures around her inner ear showed modifications that resembled those found in animals capable of echolocation. The cranial modifications suggest her brain has adapted to process acoustic information in ways that normal human neurology couldn't support, Chen noted, documenting findings that challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between skeletal structure and neural function. Vera's translucent condition showed clearly in her X-rays, revealing bone density that had been reduced to allow light transmission while maintaining structural support. Her skeleton had developed a honeycomb internal structure that maximized strength while minimizing opacity, creating the transparency that allowed observation of her circulatory system. The engineering principles involved exceed what natural selection should be able to achieve in 3 generations, Holloway observed, studying bone formations that suggested deliberate design rather than random genetic mutation. These modifications appear purposeful, as if guided by intelligence that understood the specific environmental demands these children would face. The X-rays revealed additional anomalies that extended beyond simple structural modifications. All the children showed metallic inclusions within their bone matrix, concentrations of elements that shouldn't occur naturally in human skeletal tissue, but explained the electromagnetic sensitivity that Chen's equipment had been detecting. The metallic content appears to serve as a biological antenna array, Chen theorized, noting how the inclusions formed geometric patterns that resembled electronic circuit designs. Their skeletons have essentially become receiving equipment for electromagnetic frequencies that exist in this environment. Ezra's X-rays provided the most disturbing evidence of the family's long-term adaptations. Despite his apparent age, his bones showed no signs of the density loss or structural degradation associated with normal aging. His skeletal system had achieved a state of equilibrium that suggested biological processes operating outside conventional temporal limitations. His bone age appears to be approximately 35 years, Chen reported, comparing his films to standard aging references. Yet family records suggest he should be approaching 70. Either those records are incorrect, or his skeletal system has found ways to maintain itself that modern medicine doesn't understand. Sarah's X-rays showed similar anti-aging properties, but with additional modifications that suggested her role as the family's medical practitioner. Her hands displayed enhanced bone density in areas associated with fine motor control, while her spine showed adaptations that would allow her to maintain the precise posture necessary for the botanical preparations she created. The skeletal modifications appear to be inherited, Holloway noted, comparing films across generations, but they're also adaptive, responding to the specific roles each family member serves within their community structure. The most troubling discovery came when Chen attempted to analyze bone samples using standard medical procedures. The skeletal material resisted conventional analysis techniques, its molecular structure adapting to prevent examination in ways that suggested conscious response rather than simple chemical properties. The bones themselves appear to possess some form of defensive mechanism, Chen observed, watching her analysis equipment produce readings that fluctuated beyond any normal range. They're actively preventing our attempts to understand their composition. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the examination room, the X-ray films began showing subtle changes in the bone structures they displayed. Skeletal images that had been static moments before now revealed slow movements, as if the bones were responding to observation by adjusting their internal arrangements. The implications suggested that the Whitmore family's modifications went beyond simple genetic adaptation, extending into realms where the boundary between living tissue and conscious intelligence became increasingly difficult to define. The crow feather talisman hung from a cord of braided sinew, its black surface gleaming with an oil-like sheen that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When the forest guardian emerged from between the ancient trees, the feather began to weep crimson drops that stained the ground where they fell, each droplet hissing against the earth, as if the soil itself recoiled from contact. The guardian stood nearly 7 feet tall, his form wavering between human and something far older. Bark-like skin stretched across a frame that suggested decades of living within the forest's embrace, while eyes that held the depth of old-growth shadows fixed upon the medical team with unmistakable warning. When he spoke, his voice carried the sound of wind through centuries of leaves. "You have disturbed balances maintained since before your ancestors walked these mountains," the guardian said, his words reaching the team despite lips that barely moved. "The children have shown you secrets that were not meant for outside understanding." Dr. Martinez stepped instinctively closer to her colleagues, her psychiatric training providing no framework for processing an encounter that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. The Guardian's presence seemed to press against her consciousness, creating psychological pressure that made rational thought increasingly difficult. "The talisman warns of approaching danger," Gabriel explained, his enhanced senses allowing him to perceive subtleties in the Guardian's communication that escaped the adults. "When outsiders come too close to knowledge they cannot safely possess, the feather bleeds to show the price of their curiosity." The Guardian's attention focused on Dr. Chen's medical equipment, his ancient gaze cataloguing each device with understanding that suggested familiarity with technology that predated modern civilization. When his eyes fixed on the blood sample she'd collected, the crow feather's bleeding intensified, crimson drops falling with increasing frequency. "You have taken essence from those who serve as bridges between worlds," the Guardian continued, his voice carrying undertones that seemed to resonate through the mountain itself. "Blood carries more than genetic information. It holds memories, obligations, connections to forces that your science cannot measure." Dr. Vasquez documented the encounter with hands that trembled despite her professional composure. The Guardian's presence challenged her anthropological understanding of human cultural development, suggesting continuities that extended far beyond recorded history. His knowledge of their activities implied surveillance capabilities that modern technology couldn't detect. The Whitmore family accepted guardianship of this valley through covenant, sealed in blood and sustained across generations. The Guardian explained, noting the team's scientific instruments with what might have been amusement. "Their genetic modifications serve purposes beyond survival. They maintain barriers that protect your world from influences it cannot comprehend." The crow feather talisman pulsed with bioluminescence that synchronized with the Guardian's heartbeat, if indeed he possessed such human characteristics. As the bleeding continued, the drops began forming patterns on the ground that resembled the symbols carved into the standing stones, creating a temporary map of connections that spanned the entire valley. "Your presence has awakened attention from entities that have slept for decades," the Guardian warned, his bark-like skin shifting as if responding to invisible currents in the air around them. "The children's abilities have been enhanced by your interest, their genetic modifications amplified beyond safe parameters." Dr. Holloway observed readings on his electromagnetic detection equipment that spiked beyond measurable ranges whenever the Guardian spoke. The entity seemed to exist within multiple frequency spectrums simultaneously, his presence registering across technological systems designed to detect entirely different phenomena. "What happens if we leave?" Dr. Chen asked, though her voice barely carried across the supernatural tension that filled the forest clearing. "Will the situation return to its previous balance?" The Guardian's laugh held no warmth, only the sound of wind through dead branches. "Balance, once disturbed, requires restoration through sacrifice. The knowledge you have gained carries obligations that cannot be simply abandoned. You have become part of the equation that maintains this valley's stability." The crow feather's bleeding reached a crescendo, crimson drops falling so rapidly they created streams that flowed toward the standing stones hidden deeper in the forest. The patterns they formed on the ground began to glow with the same bioluminescence that marked the children's enhanced abilities. "The entities stirring in response to your presence have been contained for over a century," the Guardian continued, his form becoming less distinct as shadows lengthened around them. "Your scientific curiosity has given them anchor points in your reality, connections they can use to extend their influence beyond this valley's boundaries." As the afternoon light faded, the Guardian's presence became increasingly oppressive, his warning carrying implications that extended far beyond the isolated Whitmore family. The crow feather talisman continued its crimson weeping, each drop marking countdown to consequences that none of them fully understood. "You must choose," the Guardian said, his voice fading like wind through distant trees. "Serve the balance you have disrupted, or face the chaos your curiosity has unleashed upon both worlds." Sarah's personal diary lay open beside her kitchen window, its pages filled with confessions written in handwriting that grew increasingly desperate with each passing year. The leather cover bore stains that Dr. Chen's analysis confirmed were tears mixed with blood, creating permanent marks that spoke of anguish beyond simple maternal concern. "Today I held Marcus while the fever broke his bones and reset them stronger," Sarah had written in an entry dated 3 years earlier. "His screams lasted 6 hours, but now he can bend his limbs in ways that will serve the valley's needs. Each generation requires greater sacrifice. Each child born must exceed their parents' capabilities." Dr. Martinez read the entries with growing horror, her psychiatric training providing framework for understanding the psychological trauma embedded within each carefully documented decision. Sarah's diary revealed the true cost of maintaining the genetic modifications that allowed the Whitmore children to survive their supernatural obligations. The twins' synchronization required surgical intervention when they were 7, another entry detailed. "I opened their skulls while they were conscious, connected neural pathways that nature had kept separate. Their shared consciousness serves the valley's communication network, but the procedure cost them individual identity. They speak as one mind now, think as unified intelligence." The diary contained medical diagrams drawn in Sarah's careful hand, showing procedures that violated every principle of ethical medicine while achieving results that modern science insisted were impossible. Each illustration bore dates that marked moments when maternal love had been sacrificed to supernatural necessity. Lily's subsonic abilities manifested too early, a more recent entry explained. Her throat was tearing itself apart, trying to produce frequencies her 7-year-old body couldn't support. "I had to reconstruct her vocal cords using materials harvested from the forest's deeper voices. She can barely speak normally now, but the valley hears her whispers across vast distances." Dr. Chen studied the anatomical precision of Sarah's drawings, noting surgical techniques that anticipated medical developments by decades while serving purposes no conventional physician would attempt. The diary documented generations of maternal sacrifice disguised as medical necessity. Vera's translucency wasn't natural. Sarah had confessed in an entry whose ink showed evidence of tears. "I injected her with compounds distilled from the stone circle's moss when she was 5. The process nearly killed her 3 times, but now her skin allows us to monitor the health of our bloodline in real time. Every pulse, every cellular change, visible through flesh that should be opaque." The psychological profiles embedded within the diary's pages revealed Sarah's gradual transformation from protective mother to reluctant participant in generational human experimentation. Each entry showed increasing acceptance of procedures that her earlier self would have found unconscionable. Gabriel's night vision required the most invasive modifications, a particularly disturbing entry detailed. "I removed his original eyes when he was 9, replacing them with organs cultivated in the ritual chamber's pools. He was blind for 3 months while the new structures integrated with his nervous system. His screams still echo in my dreams, but now he can see through darkness as if it were daylight." Dr. Vasquez documented the cultural implications of Sarah's confessions, noting how the diary revealed systematic child modification disguised as medical necessity. The entries showed how supernatural obligations had corrupted normal family relationships, turning maternal care into elaborate torture justified by cosmic necessity. "The forest demands greater sacrifices with each passing generation," Sarah had written in her most recent entry. "Ezra speaks of duties to powers older than human civilization, but it's my hands that must cut into our children's bodies, my voice that must soothe them while I destroy their humanity to preserve their supernatural function." The diary revealed that each child's modifications had been planned before birth, their genetic destinies determined by needs that extended beyond family survival to cosmic balance. Sarah's role as family doctor had evolved into something approaching priesthood of suffering. "I dream of normal children playing in normal homes," one entry confessed. "Children who sleep without nightmares of ancient obligations, who grow without surgical intervention, who love without the burden of guardianship responsibilities. But such dreams are luxuries our bloodline cannot afford." The final entries showed Sarah's growing awareness that her own children might need to sacrifice the next generation to maintain the valley's supernatural equilibrium. Her maternal instincts battled against inherited obligations that demanded continuation of practices she increasingly recognized as monstrous. The medical team's arrival changes everything, her most recent entry concluded. Their scientific curiosity has awakened forces that require stronger guardians than our current children can provide. The next generation will need modifications that exceed what any loving mother should be expected to perform. As afternoon shadows fell across the diary's pages, Sarah entered the kitchen to find the medical team reading her most private confessions. Her face showed no surprise, only the weary resignation of someone whose secrets had finally been exposed to outside judgment. The pulsing heartstone lay buried beneath the ritual chamber's floor, its rhythmic beating growing stronger with each passing hour since the medical team's arrival. When Gabriel's enhanced senses first detected the accelerating pulse, he led the investigators deeper into the underground complex, following passages that seemed to expand and contract like living arteries. The stone itself defied every geological principle Dr. Holloway had studied in 30 years of research. Roughly the size of a human heart, it pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that synchronized with electromagnetic readings from every piece of equipment in the chamber. Its surface showed veins of metallic inclusions that formed circuits too complex for natural formation, yet too organic for artificial construction. "It has been sleeping since before our family came to this valley," Ezra explained, his voice carrying new urgency as the stone's pulse quickened. Constance and Jeremiah understood that their arrival would eventually wake it, but they hoped that day would come far in the future, when their descendants were better prepared. Dr. Chen's medical instruments detected biorhythms emanating from the stone that matched human cardiac patterns, but amplified to levels that suggested a heart designed to serve something far larger than any terrestrial organism. The pulse created vibrations that traveled through the mountain's bedrock, establishing communication networks that spanned the entire valley. The children's abilities began manifesting with unprecedented intensity as the Heartstone's awakening progressed. Lily's subsonic hearing expanded beyond her bone whistle's assistance, allowing her to detect frequencies that originated from deep within the earth. Her responses to these underground voices became increasingly urgent, suggesting messages that carried warnings about approaching catastrophe. "The deep voices are angry," Lily whispered, her young voice strained from processing acoustic information that overwhelmed her modified respiratory system. "They speak of broken promises, of outsiders who have taken too much knowledge, of balances that can only be restored through sacrifice." The twins, Marcus and Matthew, experienced synchronization effects that extended beyond their usual shared consciousness. Their movements became perfectly coordinated, their speech overlapping in harmonies that created subsonic frequencies matching the Heartstone's rhythm. Their enhanced flexibility allowed them to position themselves around the chamber in configurations that amplified the stone's electromagnetic output. "We feel the mountain's pain," they spoke in unison, their voices creating standing wave patterns that made the chamber's walls resonate with sympathetic vibrations. "The awakening comes too soon, before the proper preparations have been completed. The entity stirs without adequate containment protocols in place." Vera's translucent skin began showing circulatory patterns that matched the Heartstone's pulsing, her modified blood vessels glowing with bioluminescence that created a living map of her connection to the awakening entity. Through her transparent flesh, the medical team could observe her cardiovascular system adapting to process energies that exceeded normal human physiology. "The blood remembers ancient covenants," Vera explained, her words barely audible over the increasing resonance filling the chamber. "Every heartbeat carries obligations inherited from generations past. The stone calls to our blood because our blood was designed to answer." Gabriel's enhanced night vision allowed him to perceive changes in the chamber that escaped normal human observation. Shadows moved independently of light sources, suggesting presence that existed beyond physical manifestation. His modified sensory organs detected approaching entities whose electromagnetic signatures registered as massive biological systems. "Something approaches from the deeper tunnels," Gabriel warned, his acute hearing picking up sounds that fell below the range of conventional perception. The Heartstone's awakening has called attention from things that have been dormant since our family first arrived in this valley. The chamber's temperature began fluctuating in patterns that matched the Heartstone's rhythm, creating atmospheric conditions that shouldn't occur in underground spaces. Dr. Martinez documented psychological effects that accompanied these environmental changes, noting how the stone's influence affected consciousness in ways that conventional psychology couldn't categorize. The stone's pulsing reached frequencies that began affecting the structural integrity of the chamber itself. Ancient carved walls showed stress fractures that appeared and disappeared in rhythm with the heartbeat, suggesting that the entire underground complex existed in states of reality that shifted with the entity's awareness levels. "The awakening cannot be stopped," Ezra said, his voice heavy with generations of inherited dread. "But it might be controlled if the proper rituals are performed before the entity achieves full consciousness. The blood sacrifices our family has made for over a century have been preparing for this moment." As the Heartstone's pulse reached crescendo, the chamber filled with presence that pressed against the boundaries of physical space. The entity stirring beneath the mountain was no longer dormant, its attention focusing on the valley above, with interest that carried implications far beyond the isolated Whitmore family. The medical team found themselves trapped between scientific curiosity and supernatural forces that their instruments could detect, but their understanding couldn't comprehend. The silver-binding chains lay coiled in the ritual chamber's deepest recess, their metal surfaces inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when observed directly. Forged from ore that didn't exist in any geological survey, the chains radiated cold that had nothing to do with temperature, creating frost patterns on nearby stone surfaces despite the chamber's underground warmth. Sarah Whitmore lifted the chains with hands that trembled from more than their supernatural weight. Each link had been shaped by her ancestors, she explained, using techniques that combined metallurgy with practices that predated recorded civilization. The silver itself came from veins that opened only during specific astronomical alignments, when the barrier between worlds grew thin enough to allow extraction of materials that existed partially in other dimensions. "These chains can bind entities that exist beyond physical form," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of inherited knowledge that came at terrible personal cost. "But their use requires sacrifice from those whose blood has been prepared through generations of covenant. The chains demand payment in life force that cannot be recovered." The entity stirring beneath the Heartstone had begun manifesting physical presence that challenged the chamber's structural integrity. Ancient walls bulged outward as something massive pressed against them from impossible directions, while the air itself grew thick with presence that made breathing difficult for anyone lacking the Whitmore family's genetic modifications. Dr. Chen's medical equipment registered biological signatures that exceeded her instrument's measurement capabilities. The entity's presence created electromagnetic fields that interfered with electronic devices while somehow enhancing the children's supernatural abilities beyond previously observed limits. "The binding must be performed by blood members of the Covenant," Ezra explained, his aged hands steady despite the supernatural chaos surrounding them. "But the chains require more than our family can provide. The entity has grown stronger during its century of slumber, fed by the energy we've channeled through our bloodline." Gabriel stepped forward, his enhanced senses allowing him to perceive the entity's true form as it pressed against dimensional boundaries that kept it contained within the mountain's depths. What he described defied comprehension. A consciousness vast enough to span geological formations, yet focused enough to target individual minds with surgical precision. "It speaks to us now," Gabriel reported, his modified auditory system processing communications that fell outside normal human perception. Not words, but intentions that bypass language entirely. It remembers the original covenant, but interprets our obligations differently than our ancestors intended. The twins, Marcus and Matthew, positioned themselves at opposite ends of the chamber, their synchronized consciousness creating resonance patterns that amplified the silver chain's binding properties. Their shared mental connection allowed them to coordinate responses to the entity's influence in ways that individual minds couldn't achieve. Sarah began the ritual with prayers spoken in languages that predated written history, her words creating acoustic patterns that made the chains glow with increasing intensity. The silver links grew warm, then hot, then beyond physical temperature into ranges that suggested energy exchanges occurring on quantum levels. The entity offers knowledge in exchange for freedom, Vera announced, her translucent skin revealing circulatory responses to supernatural pressures that would have killed normal humans. It shows us futures where human consciousness expands beyond current limitations, where the barriers between species and dimensions dissolve into unity. Dr. Martinez documented the psychological effects of the entity's communications, noting how its telepathic contact created altered states of consciousness that resembled religious experiences more than mental illness. The entity's promises carried seductive power that challenged rational decision-making processes. The binding ritual required blood from each family member, their genetic modifications creating circuit patterns that channeled the entity's energy through pathways that led back to the silver chains. As Sarah drew the obsidian knife across her palm, the chains responded with bioluminescence that outlined their intricate symbolic inscriptions. "The knowledge it offers comes with obligations we cannot fulfill," Sarah said through gritted teeth as the chains drew life force from her blood. Freedom for this entity would require sacrifices that extend far beyond our family, far beyond this valley. The entity's resistance to binding created pressure waves that cracked the chamber's walls, allowing glimpses of spaces that existed outside normal dimensional frameworks. Through these openings, the medical team caught sight of landscapes that suggested the entity's influence extended across multiple realities. As the silver chains tightened around forces that existed beyond physical form, Sarah's sacrifice began demanding payment that exceeded what her aging body could provide. The binding process required life force that would leave her forever diminished, but her determination to protect both her family and the outside world from supernatural contamination never wavered. The entity's final resistance created one last opportunity for escape, testing the strength of bonds forged through generations of blood sacrifice and maintained through Sarah's ultimate maternal offering. The original pact lay written on parchment that had been crafted from human skin, its surface inscribed with words that shifted between languages, as if the document existed simultaneously across multiple timelines. The blood used for the writing had maintained its crimson vitality for over a century, pulsing with each word as if the agreement itself possessed consciousness. Ezra unrolled the document with reverent terror, its contents representing the foundational contract that had bound his family to their supernatural obligations since Jeremiah and Constance first entered the valley. The parchment radiated cold that penetrated beyond physical sensation, carrying the weight of promises that transcended normal human understanding. In the year of our Lord 1847, the document began in Jeremiah's careful script. "We, being of sound mind yet desperate circumstance, do enter into covenant with the ancient presence that dwells beneath the mountain, accepting guardianship of forces that predate human civilization." Dr. Vasquez documented the contract's terms with hands that shook despite her professional composure. The anthropological implications suggested continuities between prehistoric spiritual practices and the Whitmore family's current situation that challenged academic understanding of religious development. The entity offered knowledge that would preserve human consciousness beyond death, Ezra explained, his voice heavy with inherited guilt as he translated sections written in symbols that predated alphabetic writing. Jeremiah and Constance were fleeing persecution, their abilities marking them as threats to established religious order. The entity promised sanctuary in exchange for eternal service. The pact's terms revealed obligations that extended far beyond simple guardianship. Each generation of Whitmore descendants would serve as living anchors, their modified genetics creating biological circuits that channeled the entity's influence while preventing its complete manifestation in physical reality. The bloodline modifications were not accidents of inbreeding, Ezra continued, indicating clauses written in what appeared to be Constance's flowing script. They were deliberate adaptations required by the Covenant. Each child born to our family carries genetic markers that make them capable of processing supernatural energies without being destroyed by the contact. Dr. Chen studied medical notations scattered throughout the document, finding anatomical diagrams that showed the planned genetic modifications with precision that exceeded 19th-century medical knowledge. The entity had provided detailed instructions for creating human biology capable of serving as interdimensional bridges. The entity feeds on human consciousness, Ezra revealed, his words carrying the weight of terrible understanding. Not destroying it, but using it as a lens through which to observe and influence physical reality. Our family's role has been to focus that attention while preventing it from expanding beyond controllable limits. The contract contained escape clauses written in blood that had darkened to brown with age, their terms requiring sacrifices that no family member had ever been willing to pay. Freedom from the Covenant demanded the complete extinction of the Whitmore bloodline, eliminating the genetic anchors that kept the entity contained. Jeremiah and Constance believed they were saving their descendants, Ezra said, indicating passages that revealed the siblings' naive optimism about their supernatural bargain. They thought future generations would find ways to honor the Covenant without the terrible costs we've discovered it demands. The document revealed that the entity's influence had been growing stronger with each generation, its consciousness expanding as it learned to manipulate human genetics more effectively. What had begun as simple guardianship had evolved into a symbiotic relationship that was slowly consuming the Whitmore family's humanity. The medical team's arrival triggered clauses in the Covenant that we hoped would never be activated, Ezra explained, pointing to sections written in languages that seemed to change even as they watched. Outside scientific interest in our genetic modifications has given the entity new anchor points in normal reality. Dr. Martinez documented the psychological manipulation embedded within the contract's terms, noting how the entity had structured its agreement to ensure generational compliance through emotional bonds that made escape psychologically impossible. Each child born to the family became both hostage and willing participant in maintaining supernatural balance. The entity promises to grant our children normal lives if we break the Covenant, Ezra revealed, his voice breaking with the weight of temptation that had tormented every family patriarch for over a century. But freedom for our bloodline would allow the entity to manifest fully in physical reality, using the consciousness it has absorbed to reshape the world according to its alien logic. The pact's final pages contained prophecies written in blood that remained wet despite the document's age, predicting circumstances that matched the current situation with disturbing accuracy. The entity had foreseen the arrival of outside investigators, planning for this moment since the Covenant's original signing. As shadows lengthened across the ancient document, its words began shifting more rapidly, revealing terms that had been hidden until this moment of crisis, terms that offered one final opportunity for either escape or eternal damnation. The burned medical records lay scattered across the forest floor like sacrificial offerings to forces that demanded the destruction of evidence. Dr. Chen's carefully documented findings, hours of genetic analysis, photographs of impossible anatomical structures, and detailed notes about the Whitmore family's supernatural modifications had been reduced to ash and charred fragments by flames that burned without fuel. Sarah's ultimate sacrifice had contained the entity, but at a cost that left the valley fundamentally changed. The supernatural forces that had stirred in response to outside scientific interest required appeasement through the systematic elimination of every trace of documented evidence about the family's true nature. "The knowledge must die with us," Ezra said, his voice hollow with grief as he fed the last of Chen's research notes to flames that consumed paper without producing smoke. The entity's binding holds, but only as long as no record exists to guide future investigators to the same discoveries. Gabriel and Vera had chosen to leave with the medical team, their enhanced abilities making normal life impossible, but their humanity demanding escape from the valley's supernatural obligations. They moved through the forest with obvious pain, each step taking them further from the electromagnetic fields that had supported their modified physiology since birth. "We feel the connections breaking," Vera whispered, her translucent skin already showing signs of circulation problems as her body lost access to the valley's supernatural energy sources. "Our genetic modifications were designed for this specific environment. Without the entity's influence, our enhanced capabilities become medical conditions that will slowly kill us." Dr. Martinez helped the escaping children navigate terrain that seemed to shift and change in response to their departure. The forest itself appeared to be resisting their exit, paths closing behind them while new obstacles appeared with supernatural timing. The valley did not release its guardians willingly. Marcus and Matthew had chosen to remain, their synchronized consciousness too deeply integrated with the valley's communication networks to survive separation. They stood at the tree line, their shared awareness allowing them to experience their siblings' departure through multiple perspectives simultaneously. "We are the bridge now," they spoke in unison, their voices carrying resignation that transcended their apparent youth. "Gabriel and Vera's departure means the remaining bloodline must carry greater burdens. The entity requires constant guardianship, constant sacrifice to maintain its containment." Dr. Holloway documented the systematic destruction of his genetic analysis equipment, watching decades of scientific advancement reduced to melted components by forces that left the surrounding vegetation untouched. The supernatural fire consumed only materials related to the Whitmore investigation, leaving everything else pristine. "The cover story is already being prepared," Ezra explained, indicating radio communications that crackled with official voices, discussing gas leaks, chemical spills, and environmental hazards that would justify sealing the valley from future investigation. "Government agencies that have dealt with supernatural containment before are coordinating our official non-existence." Lily remained behind, her subsonic abilities too crucial to the valley's communication systems to risk losing. But her bone whistle's songs had changed, carrying melodies that spoke of loss and transformation rather than the ancient harmonies that had marked her earlier communications with the forest's deeper voices. "The mountain grieves," she explained when asked about the new acoustic patterns. "Sarah's sacrifice saved the containment, but changed the fundamental relationships between the entity, the valley, and our family. The old agreements no longer apply." The medical team's equipment showed similar signs of supernatural interference as they prepared to leave. Electronic devices that had functioned normally throughout their investigation began displaying readings that suggested their memories of the experience were being systematically edited by forces beyond technological interference. "You will remember coming here to investigate reports of an isolated family," Ezra said, his words carrying compulsive power that pressed against their consciousness like hypnotic suggestion. "You will remember finding evidence of genetic disorders that proved less interesting than initial reports suggested. Your official recommendations will discourage further investigation." Dr. Chen felt her memories beginning to blur around the edges, scientific discoveries that had challenged her fundamental understanding of human genetics, becoming vague impressions of routine medical examinations. The supernatural editing was selective, preserving enough detail to prevent suspicion while eliminating specific knowledge that could guide future researchers. As the team prepared for their final departure, the burned medical records completed their transformation into ash that scattered on winds that carried no trace of smoke or evidence. The valley itself was conspiring to erase proof of what they had discovered, ensuring that the Whitmore family's secrets would remain protected through supernatural censorship. Behind them, the children who had chosen to remain watched their departure with eyes that held centuries of accumulated sorrow, knowing that their sacrifice would continue protecting a world that would never understand the price of its safety. The classified government file lay sealed in a vault 3 levels beneath the Centers for Disease Control, its manila folder bearing stamps that indicated clearance levels beyond what most federal employees would ever achieve. Inside, carefully sanitized reports documented the official version of the Whitmore investigation. each page crafted to discourage future inquiry while providing enough bureaucratic detail to satisfy administrative requirements. Dr. Margaret Chen signed the final non-disclosure agreement 1 year after her return from Appalachia, her signature sealing legal obligations that carried criminal penalties for unauthorized revelation of classified information. The document she signed bore little resemblance to the experiences that haunted her dreams, describing routine genetic counseling for an isolated family rather than encounters with supernatural forces that challenged scientific understanding. Environmental factors in the Whitmore Valley region produced genetic variations consistent with inbreeding depression, the official report concluded. Medical intervention proved unnecessary due to the family's adequate adaptation to their isolated circumstances. No further investigation is recommended. Gabriel and Vera had survived 6 months in the outside world before their modified genetics began failing in ways that conventional medicine couldn't address. Gabriel's enhanced night vision deteriorated first, leaving him functionally blind in normal lighting conditions, while his day vision remained impaired by adaptations designed for supernatural darkness. Vera's translucent skin became increasingly fragile without the electromagnetic support of the valley's stone circle, her visible circulatory system showing stress patterns that indicated systemic failure. Both children were currently housed in a secure medical facility that officially didn't exist, their care provided by doctors who signed agreements similar to Chen's. The subjects demonstrate genetic modifications that exceed current medical understanding. Read a classified addendum that would never see academic publication. Attempts to reverse their adaptations have proven unsuccessful. Long-term prognosis remains poor without access to environmental factors specific to their region of origin. Dr. Martinez had returned to her psychiatric practice, but found her patient interactions colored by knowledge she couldn't discuss or apply clinically. Her official reports describe the Whitmore family as displaying cultural isolation syndrome with associated behavioral adaptations, language that reduced supernatural encounters to manageable psychological categories. The family's belief systems, while unusual, represent successful adaptation to extreme environmental isolation. Her report concluded, no evidence of mental illness requiring intervention was observed. The subjects appeared well adjusted to their chosen lifestyle. The classified file contained surveillance reports that monitored the Whitmore Valley through satellite imagery and electronic detection equipment positioned at safe distances from the valley's electromagnetic anomalies. The monitoring revealed that life in the valley had continued much as before, though with notable changes in the pattern of activities around the stone circle. Thermal imaging suggests the remaining family members continue to inhabit the central homestead. Read a quarterly surveillance summary. Electromagnetic readings from the valley floor remain within acceptable parameters for continued containment. No expansion of anomalous activity beyond established boundaries has been detected. Dr. Holloway had found new employment with a government research division that officially studied environmental factors affecting human genetic expression. His real work involved cataloging and containing genetic anomalies that appeared in isolated populations around the world. His experience with the Whitmore family qualifying him for cases that regular geneticists weren't equipped to handle. Dr. Vasquez continued her anthropological research, but now worked exclusively on projects that involved cultures whose secrets posed no threat to established reality. Her official recommendation regarding the Whitmore family had emphasized the importance of preserving their traditional lifestyle without outside interference. The family represents a unique example of successful cultural adaptation to extreme geographic isolation. Her final report stated, further anthropological study would likely prove disruptive to their established social structures without providing significant academic benefit. The classified file's most heavily redacted sections dealt with protocols for containing similar supernatural threats that might emerge in other locations. The Whitmore investigation had provided valuable data about managing genetic anomalies that served as focal points for extra-dimensional entities seeking anchor points in physical reality. Established containment procedures should be applied to any similar manifestations, the protocols recommended. Scientific investigation should be limited to personnel with appropriate security clearances and psychological preparation for non-conventional phenomena. In the valley itself, Marcus and Matthew continued their synchronized guardianship, their shared consciousness, maintaining communication networks that kept the contained entity stable. Lily's subsonic songs carried new melodies that spoke of adaptation and acceptance, her communications with the forest's deeper voices, showing that the supernatural balance had been preserved despite the terrible cost. The file's final page contained a single handwritten note from an unnamed official. Some knowledge serves humanity best when it remains buried. The Whitmore family's sacrifice protects more than their isolated valley. Their silence shields a world unprepared for truths that would shatter the foundations of rational thought.